Jungkook didn't answer. The dressing room door stayed closed, but Taehyung felt the weight of it long before the truth settled in his chest. Earlier, the room had carried warmth, overlapping voices, and easy laughter that drifted between rehearsals like an inside joke shared by people who had survived the same storms. Taehyung had been the one grinning the widest, leaning against the mirror while humming low melodies just to make the stylists roll their eyes and smile despite the exhaustion that clung to everyone like static. But now, the air had shifted. It felt hollow, deliberate, like a held breath that never intended to be released. Taehyung turned toward the corner couch where Jimin sat frozen, one hand gripping his phone so tightly his knuckles looked carved from something brittle. Taehyung swallowed, the dryness in his throat dragging down like sandpaper. "He left," Taehyung finally said. His voice sounded smaller than he expected, but it cut through the silence with a truth that landed heavier than noise ever could. Jimin's head snapped up, confusion flickering in his eyes before the panic flared behind it. "What do you mean he left?" he asked, but Taehyung could hear the plea beneath the question. Not disbelief, not anger. A crack forming in real time. "No note, no call, not even a goodbye," Taehyung said, eyes shifting toward the empty rehearsal rack where Jungkook's bag should have been. The absence screamed louder than any dramatic exit could have managed. Outside, staff members whispered in hurried clusters. Security moved differently today, clipped steps and stiff radios, a choreography Taehyung hadn't been briefed on. And behind the venue barriers, ARMY had waited since dawn, humming fan chants, waving banners and rehearsing hope like a ritual. But hope would go home disappointed today. Jungkook never showed for sound check. No location shared. No message sent. No reply blinking on the screen. Taehyung hadn't realized until it was too late that silence could fracture a world faster than shouting ever had. Taehyung thought back to the last thing Jungkook had sent him. It was just a laughing bunny sticker, bright and unserious. Taehyung had snorted at it back then, replying with something equally light because that was their language, soft jabs, memes, stickers, warmth wrapped in pixels. It was typical. It was human. But now it was final. That was the part that stung. The member who once lingered longest in hallways just to finish a conversation, who laughed loudest in dressing rooms, who had looked Taehyung in the eye only the night before and said, "See you tomorrow," had disappeared between breaths. That night Seoul's skyline blinked like a cruel metaphor. The city glowed in gold veins and neon confessions, but Taehyung felt consumed by shadows. He sat on the hotel balcony, knees pulled to his chest, hood up, phone cold in his palm. The screen was still bright with unread messages, questions from staff, from members, from numbers he recognized but didn't want to answer yet. No message from Jungkook. The last chat between them was still that laughing sticker exchange. Taehyung pressed the phone to his forehead like it could reverse time. It felt unreal until the guilt began narrating back at him. Jungkook had been distant, quieter, less playful. The shift had been subtle, masquerading as tiredness or stress. Taehyung had mistaken the quiet for burnout, for exhaustion that would eventually pass like rain over studio windows. But time ran out. Space became distance. And distance became a choice no one else saw until the silence drowned everything. He hadn't noticed the packed suitcase by the wardrobe corner, the longer showers, the way Jungkook lingered at the edges of conversations like someone rehearsing disappearance. Taehyung replayed every moment of the last month in his head. Had he been selfish? Too absorbed in his own world to notice the cracks forming next to him. Jungkook never asked for help, but Taehyung also never pushed hard enough to make him answer. And now, the silence felt condemning because it carried the shape of someone who had once trusted him with everything. The studio didn't sound the same anymore. The mic stand where Jungkook always stood looked untouched, almost reverent, like a monument no one had the heart to move yet. Taehyung closed his eyes. Somewhere out there, Jungkook was breathing easier. Or maybe he was. Taehyung just hoped the silence wasn't permanent. Not because of promotions or stages or expectations, but because of the parts of themselves they had once built side by side in the noise, now trembling in the quiet. The question echoed anyway, looping in Taehyung's pulse like a low note that refused resolution. Why didn't he say goodbye? And for the first time in a long time, Taehyung realized that some silences weren't gaps. They were signals. Signals he had missed, and signals he would never ignore again, not if Jungkook ever walked back into the room, even just as a whisper. Taehyung sat through the aftermath like someone trapped between realities. The group's promotions had been paused, the agency scrambling to draft statements that said everything and nothing at once. When the announcement finally came, it was predictably vague. Jungkook is taking time for himself. We ask for your understanding. The words were corporate clean, stripped of emotion, yet the fandom felt every syllable like a gut punch. Taehyung didn't need to read the comments to know the reaction. He could already imagine ARMY splitting into fragments, confused, defensive, furious, grief-struck, and relentlessly loud in their silence. The speculation would roar for weeks, a storm built from love that had nowhere to land. Taehyung had always considered himself observant, someone who saw emotions in micro-expressions and pauses between sentences. He noticed when members changed the way they exhaled after a note, when their voices carried hidden weather. Yet somehow he hadn't noticed Jungkook packing up pieces of himself in plain sight. The suitcase tucked behind the wardrobe, the extra minute he took to zip it when he thought no one was looking. The dorm had carried its own kind of silence now, the walls echoing old V Live jokes and backstage antics that suddenly felt like artifacts in a gallery, dedicated to ghosts who hadn't died but had left anyway. One evening, Taehyung wandered into the old dorm they hadn't used regularly in years. It was impulsive, irrational even, yet intentional in the way grief sometimes mimicked muscle memory. He unlocked Jungkook's old room with a key that felt heavier than metal should have been. The space was unchanged in structure but emptied of life. Shelves still lined the walls, but nothing sat on them. The closet door slightly ajar, but the hangers were barren. The bed neatly made, yet only one jacket remained on it. It was his jacket, the one Jungkook had borrowed during a rain-soaked rehearsal and forgotten to return. Taehyung picked it up, holding it like evidence of a conversation that had never finished. He sat on the edge of the mattress, letting the weight dip beneath him. The room didn't accuse him. It didn't need to. His heart did the job just fine. He had loved Jungkook in ways that didn't require labels. It was love that lived in shared headphones, midnight ramen runs, lyric debates, and quiet companionable pauses that felt safer than confessions. But now the silence between them felt like an unclosed parenthesis in the universe, grammar that begged completion. Jimin had tried to pull him out of it. So had Namjoon, sending voice notes every morning that sounded gentle but helpless. Even Yoongi, sharp-eyed and notoriously economical with words, had stayed on the phone late one night, saying nothing yet offering presence like a life raft. The quiet was heavy but communal, the members circling around Taehyung like satellites trying to stabilize a collapsing star. But none of them were Jungkook. And none of them could replace the shape of absence he had carved into the group's rhythm. Taehyung spent nights watching old fan cams and behind-the-scenes compilations, studying the microshifts he once ignored. The way Jungkook lingered at the edge of conversations, nodding a second too long before speaking, like someone memorizing voices before leaving them behind. The longer showers weren't burnout. They were rehearsal for departure. The quiet humming in hallways wasn't exhaustion. It was elegy. Taehyung hated that he understood too late that leaving quietly could be louder than leaving loudly. He started writing voice memos of his own, confessions spoken into drafts that would never be sent. Wherever you are, I hope you're breathing easier. I hope you're safe. I'm sorry I didn't ask sooner if you were okay. I'm sorry I thought you'd always stay. He didn't send it, not because he didn't mean it, but because the silence between them had no inbox. No destination, no refresh button, only echo. Then the first envelope arrived. It was brown, unmarked, no return address, no postage clue that could be traced. The manager handed it to him with a face that suggested hesitation, like even the adults in the room knew not to push the moment. Taehyung opened it slowly, expecting chaos, revelation, or explanation. Instead, he found a photo. The seven of them drenched after a rain-soaked rehearsal, smiling wide, exhausted alive, the kind of alive that felt borrowed when replayed. Taehyung traced a thumb over Jungkook's face in the picture. The photo didn't smile back, it simply remembered. Behind it was a short letter in Jungkook's handwriting. The lines were neat but emotionally uneven, like the pen pressed harder at parts that hurt more. "Don't look for me. I'm not lost. I just can't be who they want anymore. I hope one day you'll understand. I hope one day I'll be able to tell you this face to face." There was no signature. It didn't need one. Taehyung held the photo to his chest and cried, not because of betrayal, but because he understood now that Jungkook didn't leave because he hated them. He left because he didn't know how to stay. That night, Taehyung walked into the studio again. The staff had packed up hours ago. The coffee was cold, microphones off-balanced and unmonitored, but the silence was different this time. Not accusing, not condemning, just honest. He sat on the same stool Jungkook once used, pulled a guitar into his lap and played something unfinished. The song wasn't good yet, but it was true. And truth, Taehyung realized, was the only genre that could survive disappearance. Taehyung didn't speak about the envelope at first. He let the photo live on the nightstand for hours before any of the members saw it, like he was bracing for a reaction he couldn't yet predict. When Jimin eventually stepped into the room, drawn by the dim light leaking from the cracked studio door, his gaze landed on the picture Taehyung had placed face up, edges still slightly curled from the envelope's pressure. Jimin exhaled a small, involuntary sigh. The kind that sounded like recognition and grief speaking in the same breath. Taehyung watched him from across the room, posture stiff, guitar still resting in his lap. He didn't have the strength to narrate the moment yet, but Jimin didn't need a script. He just crossed the room and sat beside him quietly. "It's him, isn't it?" Jimin asked. Taehyung nodded once. The motion was tiny but seismic. The studio felt like a confessional booth carved from glass and soundproof foam, designed for honesty no one ever practiced until it was necessary. Namjoon entered minutes later, followed by Yoongi, the latter carrying 2 steaming cups of tea like warmth could act as punctuation for silence. They didn't ask to hold the photo. They simply acknowledged it. That was their language now. No interrogations, only presence. Outside, the fandom was louder than ever. Jungkook MIA had spiraled beyond a headline into a global chant of worry, betrayal theories, and emotional fracture points. Fans parsed airport sightings, staff movement patterns, stylist schedules, and security radio slips like cryptographers decoding heartbreak. Taehyung knew the agency wanted him to help stabilize the narrative, but stability wasn't his job tonight. Healing was. He thought about the month before Jungkook left. The small clues that had looked like ordinary exhaustion but now rearranged themselves into evidence. Jungkook had started avoiding eye contact first in mirrors, then in conversations, then everywhere. The laughter had thinned out like sound fading at the edge of a long hallway, the kind of fade you only register when you try to remember its shape. Taehyung had mistaken it for routine fatigue, but fatigue didn't explain the deliberate quiet, the rehearsed politeness, the emotionally tidy excuses that sounded like lines memorized in a language class of detachment. Jungkook had been disappearing in increments. Taehyung had been the one stitching over the silence with assumptions, and assumptions, he realized now, were the enemy of retention, both in concerts and in people. He replayed every shared moment like film spooled too tight. The late-night harmonies hummed into jacket collars. The debates about bridge sections of songs that didn't exist yet. The way Jungkook would tilt his head when Taehyung spoke, like Taehyung's voice was a home frequency he never planned to lose. One afternoon, Taehyung found himself back in a rehearsal room alone, flipping through old Polaroids the company had archived for anniversary content. He wasn't meant to be there. The archive room was off-limits without PR supervision, but grief didn't respect access permissions. He found a photo strip of the 7 of them during their first year, cheeks rounder, hair darker, schedules brutal, smiles triumphant because they hadn't yet learned what losing someone quietly felt like. Taehyung traced a finger over Jungkook's face again. He had done that a lot lately, tracing, memorizing, trying to make a map from a face. Taehyung thought about guilt differently now. It wasn't a verdict. It was a compass that pointed backward, cruelly precise. He could hear staff outside whispering about trending hashtags, about fan confusion turning into disappointment, about disappointment fermenting into blame. He could already imagine his own name floating somewhere in those accusations. But he wasn't afraid of the blame anymore. He was afraid of repeating the silence that caused it. The members didn't try to pull him out of the quiet. They stepped into it instead, sitting on the floor around him one night after dinner, letting the dorm living room turn into an orbit of hoodies, socked feet, and unscheduled honesty. Yoongi eventually broke one of those long pauses. "You're writing again." It wasn't a question. It was an observation wrapped in permission. Taehyung had been scribbling lines in notebooks that no longer cared about stage suitability. Lines that cared about breathing, vanishing, returning, and the terrifying algebra of being loved by millions but seen by too few. Taehyung realized that night that writing wasn't a comeback. It was proof of life. Jungkook had sent 5 sentences. Taehyung would spend months learning how to answer them without sending anything at all. Because silence wasn't emptiness anymore. It was waiting. And waiting, Taehyung knew, was a language ARMY understood better than anyone. They waited for comebacks, for teasers, for airport glimpses, for healing. And now, for the first time, the members were waiting too, not for a stage, but for a boy who didn't know how to stay yet, but might one day know how to return. The silence that followed Jungkook's departure grew heavier before it softened, the way fog first suffocates before it reveals shape. Taehyung lived in that paradox now. The agency had stopped calling it a hiatus in private meetings. They were calling it containment. But containment was a word for headlines, not hearts. Taehyung contained nothing. He leaked instead, emotions spilling into notebooks, voice memos saved to drafts, guitar melodies recorded without intent to publish. The group had scattered in schedules but united in orbit, members checking on each other like constellations refusing to lose a star twice. Taehyung had stopped sleeping through nights, not from insomnia alone but from a restless need to witness quiet, to learn the acoustics of absence. He sat in empty practice rooms long after the staff left, mic stands casting thin shadows under dim ceiling lights. He remembered how Jungkook once treated silence like a prank setup, letting it stretch just long enough before detonating it with laughter. But this time, Jungkook detonated nothing. He disarmed the room instead, removing himself like a fuse pulled with precision. ARMY's disappointment had turned global, trending in languages Taehyung couldn't read but could feel. Stadium banners, canceled flight bookings, midnight live streams dissecting every missed cue from Jungkook's last month on camera. Fans weren't grieving a show. They were grieving access, identity, narrative continuity. Jungkook had been a story ARMY helped write. His silence felt like someone closed the document without saving. Inside the dorm, the room where Jungkook used to drop lyrics on napkins felt like a museum curated by muscle memory. Taehyung would pass the kitchen counter and see ghost outlines of late-night ramen bowls, half-finished sports drinks, scribbled bridge ideas for songs they never finished arguing about. He would pick up random objects Jungkook had left behind weeks before leaving, bracelets, headphones tangled like vines, an in-ear pack he never bothered zipping, and feel his chest ache not from possession but from proof. Proof someone had once been here in 4K emotional resolution, now downgraded to memories. Jimin noticed Taehyung spiraling differently than before. It was no longer a frantic search for clues. It was self-auditing, emotional forensic work. Taehyung would sit cross-legged on the living room rug, flipping through old Polaroids and fan gifts the company archived for anniversary promotions. The other members didn't stop him. They simply learned how to sit beside him without breaking the ritual. Namjoon would bring coffee every morning, placing the cup beside Taehyung silently, a warm beacon in a night that refused sunrise. Taehyung would sip it slowly. Coffee used to taste like deadlines. Now it tasted like evidence of survival. Yoongi would call late at night and say nothing, letting the line stay open like a promise that didn't need punctuation. Even Hobai, allergic to quiet, had learned how to whisper energy instead of shouting it. They were all speaking a new dialect of stillness. Taehyung began writing not songs but letters to himself, pages filled with questions he never had time to articulate while living in the chaos of global superstardom. One letter read, "I thought strength meant not asking. Now I know strength is asking even when silence looks fine." Another, "Leaving quietly is not weakness. It is editing your life for accuracy." These weren't stage lyrics. They were thesis statements written in pencil with shaky hands. One night after an especially long rehearsal that no one performed, Taehyung sat on the edge of the stage, legs hanging off, phone in hand. The screen had become colder, a graveyard of refreshed gestures. He thought back to the moment he missed Jungkook's bag disappearing. The bag hadn't vanished suddenly. It had thinned. First a jacket removed, then a charger, then everything. Taehyung realized that night that vanishing was rarely one event. It was subtraction practiced in the open until the world noticed the missing sum. ARMY had been humming since dawn that day. The hum would go unanswered. Taehyung had mistaken quiet for tiredness. But tiredness didn't explain the cleanly folded bedsheet, the emptied shelves, or the single jacket left behind. Jungkook had left quietly. But the quiet was deliberate, a narrative decision made with intention. Taehyung hadn't seen the final edit until it was exported into loss. The agency put out statements. Fans put out theories. Taehyung put out nothing. But nothing was louder now, because Taehyung was no longer just grieving the departure. He was studying it. Studying how someone who once treated dressing rooms like comedy sets and practice halls like playgrounds could orchestrate a silent exit that felt louder than any stadium mic drop. The guilt didn't feel like blame anymore. It felt like curriculum. Taehyung had enrolled in the lesson unwillingly, but now he intended to graduate from it honestly. Because if Jungkook could vanish quietly, then Taehyung could learn how to narrate silence without breaking it prematurely. Taehyung stood in the empty practice hall one afternoon, mic stands like gravestones for songs not yet buried. He whispered into the void, "I didn't notice you were slipping. I won't miss it again." The silence didn't answer, but it listened. Taehyung began to measure days not by schedules, but by the weight they left behind. The agency still sent calendar updates, still talked about tour legs and promotional windows, but for Taehyung, the window he stared at now was literal. The dorm's balcony glass, where city lights blurred into watercolor when your eyes refused to stay dry. Jungkook's silence had created a before and after timeline in the group that no press release could ever diagram accurately. The other members watched Taehyung become quieter in a way that wasn't retreat, it was refinement. He spoke less because he was listening more, replaying emotional data, scanning memory like a satellite resweeping a signal that had gone dark. ARMY continued to trend their grief, but the tone had mutated. Disappointment was evolving into a mix of longing and investigative obsession. Fans weren't just asking where Jungkook was, they were asking how no one saw him leaving while he was still there. Taehyung asked himself the same question every night, but he asked it like prayer, not prosecution. The guilt had crystallized, sharp-edged but transparent. He could see through it now, which made it cut differently. He remembered the night before Jungkook left. They had all been in the dorm. Jungkook was sitting at the kitchen island, scrolling through his phone, humming faintly. The hum sounded ordinary at the time, like someone idling between exhaustion and creativity. Taehyung had walked past him, squeezed his shoulder once and said, "Long day, huh?" Jungkook had smiled. One soft, polite smile. The kind of smile you give when you don't want your truth to inconvenience anyone. That smile now replayed in Taehyung's mind like a mistranslated lyric, hearing the melody, missing the meaning, realizing too late that the chorus was goodbye. Taehyung had always believed emotional loyalty meant filling silence with reassurance. But Jungkook didn't want reassurance. He wanted to be noticed accurately. Taehyung realized now that silence was not a blank page, it was fine print. The details you had to lean in to read. One afternoon, Taehyung and Hobi sat in the living room going through fan letters the agency had forwarded from storage. The letters were written in different inks, different alphabets, different emotional temperatures, but all converged on the same core frequency. Jungkook, come back. Jungkook, we miss you. Jungkook, explain the silence. Taehyung picked up a letter addressed vaguely to BTS member who's hurting the most right now. He almost laughed. Almost. Because ARMY always knew where to send their intuition, even when they didn't know the address. He opened it. The fan wrote, loving someone loudly is easy. Loving someone quietly is how you keep them alive. Taehyung set the letter down slowly. His breath felt too big for his chest. He finally understood what Jungkook had done. He wasn't running away from love. He was running toward a quieter version of it, one that didn't require performing stability for the world. Taehyung had started composing melodies again, but they were skeletal, soft minor progressions that sounded like footsteps on sand, not stadium floors. Yoongi overheard one of those late-night recordings leaking from under the studio door. He didn't comment on the sadness. He commented on the craft. It sounds unfinished, Yoongi said. Taehyung nodded. Because it is. And unfinished, he realized, was honest. Jungkook had left mid-song. Taehyung would answer mid-song too. Jungkook once told Taehyung that music was the safest place to say things you couldn't pronounce in conversations. But Taehyung had flipped the equation now. Music was the safest place to admit you had misread someone. ARMY clips of Jungkook's last concert circulated endlessly. Every tiny moment that had once looked like normal tiredness now felt like emotional foreshadowing. Fans zoomed into micro-expressions, the glances he didn't make, the sentences he trimmed too early, the way his duffel bag had sat by the door hours before departure, treated like furniture no one questioned until the house felt wrong without it. Taehyung questioned everything now. Not to undo the exit, but to map the doorframe so precisely that no one could ever leave through it unnoticed again. The group chat between the members had become quieter too, not abandoned, just less decorative. When Namjoon sent updates, they were brief. When Jimin checked in, it was one sentence, "You good? I'm here." When Taehyung replied, it was equally short, "Learning to be." Because that was the truth. Taehyung was learning to be someone who could witness silence without fearing it, someone who could recognize departure cues before they became public subtitles for loss. One night, Taehyung stood on the balcony again, cold air sharp enough to outline thought. He whispered into the wind like ARMY whispered into comment sections. "I finally saw you're quiet. I hope one day you hear mine." The city hummed back, not an answer, a continuation. Taehyung used to believe silence was something you survived, something you walked through quickly so the echo wouldn't catch your name. But now he knew silence could carry shape, intention, even confession if you were patient enough to hear its edges. Jungkook's departure had rewritten Taehyung's understanding of absence, not as abandonment, but as a mirror held too close, reflecting truths no one had prepared to look at in full resolution. The dorm had become a softer place in the weeks that followed. Softer didn't mean healed. It meant absorbent. Grief landed quietly now, soaked in without splash, acknowledged without ceremony. The agency kept releasing official updates, carefully measured statements engineered for SEO traction and public stability. But Taehyung knew the algorithm that mattered most wasn't digital. It was emotional retention, the art of keeping someone present in the heart long enough for meaning to settle instead of scatter. ARMY's disappointment still circulated like a storm front, but the thunder had changed pitch. The outrage waves were thinning into a more complicated weather system, longing, blame, curiosity, sorrow, and a new hunger for emotional autopsy. The fandom was asking questions no interview could answer. Why did Jungkook leave quietly? How did the group miss the signs? Was the silence intentional? Was it loneliness in disguise? Theories spiked engagement charts across platforms, boosting discourse velocity, but Taehyung wasn't threatened by the noise anymore. Noise was ARMY caring loudly. What haunted him was the quiet that had come before it. Taehyung thought back to the day the clues began accumulating like unsent messages. Jungkook had stopped leaving his shoes crooked by the door. Then he stopped leaving them there at all. He started folding hoodies with military precision instead of letting them drape like personality across chairs. He laughed less in wide arcs and more in polite commas, short bursts that didn't demand continuation. His duffel bag had appeared one morning by the sofa half-packed, but no one read it as a narrative event. They read it as temporary clutter, the normal debris of a life lived at idle speed. Taehyung realized now that departures were rarely dramatic deletions. They were quiet drafts saved under vague file names until the world opened the folder by accident and found the missing sum. One night after practice, Jimin sat beside Taehyung in the lounge area, legs pulled up, chin resting on his knees. "You keep replaying it," Jimin said. Taehyung didn't deny it. "Because I was there but I wasn't seeing it." Jimin nodded like someone who understood that grief wasn't repetition, it was review. Review was how you improved the next performance, even if the stage was human connection. Namjoon had stopped trying to translate Jungkook's silence for Taehyung. He translated Taehyung's silence for the room instead. He would sit at the dining table reading quietly while Taehyung sketched melody fragments, neither intruding nor interpreting, just coexisting in the same emotional bandwidth. Yoongi would drop instrumental loops into Taehyung's laptop without comment, small lifelines disguised as workflow. Hobi would leave encouraging voice notes in the group chat, softer than his usual tone, energy delivered in embers, not fireworks. Taehyung began composing again, not for a comeback but for continuity. The melodies sounded like reflective confessionals, layered with keywords of emotion that resonated universally. Quiet, departure, unnoticed signs, late realization, friendship fracture, understanding, healing, hope. These weren't engineered for virality. They were engineered for truth, which ironically made them more shareable than any polished press quote. Truth had the highest RPM when it hit emotional currency, instead of promotional gloss. Taehyung also began recording spoken voice drafts, short reflections he might never publish, but needed to pronounce somewhere, even if the audience was only the microphone diaphragm listening back. One memo read, "Leaving quietly is not the tragedy. The tragedy is thinking quiet means fine." Another, "Friendship doesn't break when someone leaves. It breaks when no one reads the leaving as a sentence worth finishing." ARMY edits of Jungkook's final concert kept resurfacing. Every moment that had once looked ordinary now looked subtitled in hindsight. The camera pans he avoided, the jokes he trimmed too early, the small inhalations before lines he never delivered. Fans were performing the review Taehyung had enrolled in unwillingly, proof that fandom engagement wasn't always romanticizing. Sometimes it was remembering more accurately than the archive ever did. Taehyung didn't resent Jungkook for leaving quietly. He resented himself for misreading the quiet as routine decoration. One afternoon, Taehyung stood in a rehearsal hall alone, staring at the mic stand center stage. He imagined Jungkook's voice occupying the air again, filling frequencies that no longer vibrated. He whispered not to summon him but to mark the moment, "I see the silence now." The hall said nothing back, but nothing felt like listening. Listening felt like respect. Respect felt like love without volume, the kind Jungkook had been searching for. Taehyung walked back to the dorm that evening feeling different. Not lighter, calibrated. Calibrated meant ready to notice before the world demanded explanation. Because if Jungkook had exited in silence, then Taehyung would re-enter silence differently too. Not as someone who feared the echo, but someone who finally understood the fine print. And fine print, Taehyung knew, was where the real story lived. Taehyung eventually learned that silence wasn't a wound, it was a doorway. Some doors closed softly, some opened the same way. Jungkook had left without a word, but he didn't leave without meaning. Meaning was what lingered after sound stopped vibrating. ARMY had been disappointed, confused, even hurt. But disappointment was just love reacting to a missing presence it wasn't ready to lose. And Taehyung understood that better than anyone now. Because he had felt the silence in his bones before the world turned it into subtitles. If there was one thing Taehyung wanted ARMY to take from this story, it wasn't sadness. It was awareness. The quietest people in the room sometimes need the loudest attention. Not noise, not pressure, just being seen clearly. Taehyung hoped that wherever Jungkook was now, he had finally found a version of quiet that didn't feel like disappearing. A quiet that felt like breathing without apology. Taehyung stood in the practice hall one last time before this chapter ended, hand brushing the mic stand like an old friend's shoulder. He didn't ask the air to answer anymore. He just let it listen, because listening was enough. And enough was honest. Honest was healing. Healing was hope. To ARMY, the ones who stayed even when the story felt unfinished, thank you. Thank you for caring loudly, for reviewing the quiet we missed, for loving the spaces between the words as much as the words themselves. Thank you for giving BTS the grace to be human inside a narrative the world keeps trying to format into perfection. You didn't leave when the silence came. You leaned in to hear it. That matters. That changes everything. I'm Taehyung, and this was my story of noticing too late, understanding in the middle, and hopping forward. If Jungkook taught me anything, it's this. Silence doesn't ask to be fixed. It asks to be witnessed. So I'll end it the only way that feels right now, with gratitude instead of punctuation. ARMY, thank you for staying, for listening, for loving, for waiting with us, not at us. Where words stopped, you carried the meaning, and meaning is why we're still here. See you in the next story. Stay safe, stay kind, stay aware. With love, Taehyung.